Hello, good evening. How's everybody doing? Welcome. I'm Lyda Dubin. I'm the executive director here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you all are joining us tonight for the first time for this event? Oh, wonderful. Good. Welcome. Welcome. Come back and see us. The Center for Fiction, we focus on the creation and the enjoyment of fiction, and we make community here in this space every day, every week, through public events like this one. We have reading groups, writing workshops, a wonderful kids read program. We award a first novel prize and run a fellowship program for emerging writers. Applications, in fact, are now open for the Emerging Writer Fellowship. So if you are a New York City-based fiction writer and you have not yet published a book, please apply. So check out our website. Follow us on social media, sign up for our mailing list so that you don't miss finding out what's going to be happening here. To support our work, please consider a full membership to the center and enjoy perks, discounts, and sort of belonging to this place that supports creative work. I want to do a welcome to those of you joining us tonight via the live stream. After the talk, we'll have an audience Q&A. So if you are here, raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring the mic for you. And do use the mic so that our guests on the live stream can hear you. Also, you can add questions on the chat if you're joining on YouTube, and we'll read one of those at least before the break. Claire was kind enough to pre-sign her books, and we'll be doing a personalization line after the event. So we'll line up in here for that. We are here to celebrate the publication of this strange, eventful history by the celebrated writer Claire Messud. I couldn't put it down when I got an early copy from Winter Institute. So I am thrilled right now to bring to the stage Claire with beloved author and our neighbor, Jennifer Egan. Come on.
Thank you all so much for being here. I am very excited to talk with Claire Messud, an author whose work I have been following for decades. And we're going to actually start, just to get all of us into the mood, by listening to a little bit of this wonderful novel, and then I will leap in with questions, and we will open up to your questions in a bit. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Jenny, for doing this with me. Thank you all for coming this evening. It's very thrilling to be here. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the prologue of this novel, which we'll talk about it. Which spans a lot of time. I guess it spans a lot of time, from 1940 to 2010. But I'll just read. This is the prologue is in the voice of a character who doesn't then come back until halfway through the book, named Chloe. I'm a writer. I tell stories. Of course, really, I want to save lives, or simply, I want to save life. I'm a writer. I tell stories. I want to tell the stories of their lives. It doesn't really matter where I start. We're always in the middle. Wherever we stand, we see only partially. I know also that everything is connected, the constellations of our lives moving together in harmony and disharmony. The past swirls along with and inside the present, and all time exists at once around us. The ebb and flow, the harmonies and dissonance, the music happens whether or not we describe it. A story is not a line. It is a richer thing, one that circles and eddies, rises and falls, repeats upon itself. And so this story, the story of my family, has many possible beginnings or none. Mare Nostrum, Saint Augustine, Abdelkader, Charles de Gaulle, my parents, Larba, my father, my aunt, Zora Drift, my mother, Albert Camus, Toronto, Cambridge, Toulon, Tlemcen, oh, Tlemcen. All and each a part of the vast and intricate web. Any version, only partial. Or I could begin with my birth, or my father's birth, or his father's birth, or my mother's or grandmother's. I could begin with the secrets and shame, the ineffable shame that in telling their story I would wish at last to heal. The shame of the family history, of the history into which we were born. How to forget that after attending the birth of his first grandson, my father, elderly then, tripped on the curb and fell in the street, a toppled mountain, and as he lay with the white down of his near bald head in the gutter's muck, he muttered, not help me, but I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I could begin, of course, with the aloneness. Or I could begin with the fact that the owner of our local pizzeria and our former next-door neighbor is an Algerian man whose surname is also the name of the provincial Algerian town of his ancestors, the same town in which my Pied Noir grandmother taught at the girls' school in her youth, in the years before she married. Years that were in her case numerous because she didn't marry until her mid-30s, then an age by which women were deemed unmarriageable. She might even have taught my neighbor's grandmother or great-grandmother. Or I could begin with the fact that the beloved Lebanese friends of my grandfather's pre-war posting in Beirut include the great-uncle of a dear friend of mine in this American life almost a century later, whose daughter played with our son from the time they were round-limbed toddlers. Or I could begin with the angels on my father's last journey to death, the witnesses to his many lives who appeared, sentinels and guides along that final path to guide him, the ultimately homeless, to his eternal home. It doesn't matter so much where this story begins as that it begins. And if, as I've come to understand, the story is infinitely expanding, rather than a line or thread, then wherever I start is merely that, not the beginning, but a mere moment, a way of happening, a mouth.
Thank you so much. So this is a really, it's an encompassing, sweeping, epic story that involves 3 generations of a family named the Cassars. And they are all 3 generations, and several people in each, are grappling with their own history, geopolitically and personally. And I'm assuming that a lot of people in this room probably haven't read the book. It just came out. That history begins in Algeria. And I wonder if you could situate us both in this family's origin there and also just in the historical relationship between France and Algeria, which you actually summarize very succinctly and clearly in the novel. I wouldn't ask you to do it here. But for us Americans who are often a little fuzzy on history, as you point out in the novel, I think that would be helpful.
Sure, absolutely. So as Jenny says, the novel is about 3 generations of a family. The oldest generation, there's a patriarch named Gaston and his wife Lucienne, and they're born essentially at the beginning of the 20th century. And then their children, François and Denise, who were born in the early 30s, and then a third generation born in the 60s. The Algerian situation, so the white colonials in Algeria are known in what is considered a pejorative term, the pieds noirs, the Blackfeet. And France colonized Algeria in 1830, and it remained under French rule right up until 1962, when it gained its independence after a war that started in 1954. But there were uprisings much earlier than that. But the war was from 1954 to 62. And I think also just maybe worth mentioning, there were in French colonialism, as in British colonialism and other nations, European nations, colonialisms, various types of colonialism. But Algeria, so there were protectorates and mandates and, all sorts of different names for the types of colonialism, but Algeria was settler colonialism. So, like the United States and Canada, like Australia, the sort of mentality was, there aren't many people there, we'll just all move there, we'll just settle it. Yeah, and so Algeria was actually a department of France. So if you know that France is divided up into what you might call counties almost that are called departments, Algeria was considered a department of France.
Interesting. Okay. And the patriarch's name is Gaston. And am I correct to think that your grandfather's name was Gaston as well?
Yes, it was.
So that seems like a kind of direct nod to something that you refer to in your acknowledgments, which is that a trove of family documents or a particular document underlies some of this story. And I wonder if you could just, without getting into sort of what's true and what's not, which is always a kind of vexed question anyway with fiction, and I think not the interesting question, I'm just curious about the origin story of the book and your relationship to this material and how it led you into the novel.
Right. So my grandfather, in his retirement in the 1970s, wrote for my sister and for me, wrote by hand a family memoir, quite long, about 1,500 pages, with telegrams and photographs and receipts and letters sort of pasted in. It takes up 5 big binders that were always in my grandparents' apartment when I was growing up, and that eventually, after everybody died, came finally to me, and I read it in its entirety. I had read little pieces. He'd had some of it typed up, a sort of condensed 100 or 200 pages typed up at some point, which I guess I looked at but didn't really read, and then I spent several months reading this document in 2017 when I was on leave from teaching, and the document. I mean, it's a little confusing because the document covers 1928 when my grandparents married through 1946, so it doesn't go beyond that. So the novel, because the novel goes from 1940 to 2010, there's much of it that is not related to that document. And initially, there was the question: what should I do? Should I try to write something just about that period, or should I, use more of the memoir? And that was sort of complicated because the memoir, while wonderful to me, was actually written, not for publication but for us, and has lots of sort of gossipy stuff about sort of relations and family friends, and that it turns out. Did you know there was a lot of wife swapping in Beirut in the 30s? Right. So there's but anyway. So I also was reading some family letters. So along the way, after that.
And what kind of writer was your grandfather? What was it like as a text?
He was a. It's a funny thing because it's obviously it's in French, and some people have said, was it difficult for you because I speak French, but and I said no, because his French is my French, so I didn't actually have to look up anything, the syntax made total sense to me, and he had always said that our grandmother, who was demented already had dementia when I was a child. Everybody in the family said, "Oh, she was the writer, really." And when I finally read some letters of hers that are included in this memoir, I was like, "Oh, she was a really good writer. She was maybe a better writer than he was, just in terms of she had a more lyrical, a sort of, she would have beautiful nature descriptions and so on that were really quite lovely. But he had some great details. Yeah, he's good with the details."
And so how did you, I mean, you said that you weren't quite sure what to do with this material, and in the prologue you just read us, that it's actually overtly grappling with the question of how to begin a story that, of course, never really has a beginning or an end. It just depends on where you jump in. So how did you jump in? What did you start with?
So I started in 1940. So the first section of the book is, there's a section for each decade between 1940 and 2010. I perhaps think of it almost like a probe going down into a moment, rather than trying to cover the whole decade, but just as if something were sort of a camera were kind of periscope, but the opposite of a periscope, whatever. Yeah, were just happening, every so often and at a different moment in the decade each time. But 1940 was such a it starts in June 1940, which was such a big moment historically, of course. And my grandfather and his family had recently been separated. So he was the naval attaché in first he'd been in Beirut, but then he'd been assigned to Salonika, which is Thessaloniki in Greece. He was just doing a little spying on the Italians, and that's in May. It became clear that Italy was soon going to enter the war, and if Italy entered the war before he sent his family back, because they weren't going to go in a boat across from Greece to Algeria, they had to go overland across Italy to France, down through France to Marseille, and then on a boat. And if they missed the moment and Italy entered the war, they wouldn't be able to get back. So he sent them off, and didn't then hear from them. So he didn't know if they'd arrived. He didn't know where they were. And then there was the fall of France. And then he was there in Thessaloniki on June 18th and heard de Gaulle's radio broadcast calling everyone to fight for a free France. And he had to make a choice. He had to make a choice whether he would go do that or whether he would stay, follow orders and go to Beirut. And because because his primary consideration was his wife and children, that's what he did, was follow orders and go to Beirut.
Which is actually a critical choice. I mean, in a way, he ends up on the wrong side of history there. Although for him, there almost is no choice. He's very, very attached to his wife in a way that struck me as unusual. And although it may just be my stereotypes, but for sort of a naval officer, his sense of connection to his wife, his almost helplessness without her, makes it impossible for him to imagine kind of, and he resists de Gaulle. He finds him sort of self-involved, and he bridles at the tone. But then he really pays a price for that in his future life. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So how much in the weeds should I get? I mean, things that I didn't know, but that maybe everybody here knows. So when there was when there was is it called a truce? Was it a truce? Whatever it was, whatever their agreement was, with Pétain and the Germans. The French Navy was hors de combat. They were out of the war. That was a part of the agreement, was that the French Navy would not fight. This is now maybe more information, but the British didn't believe they wouldn't fight, and so they torpedoed the ships at Mers el Kebir. But the thing actually relevant here. So then my grandfather was eventually. First, he was 6 months in neutral Istanbul, then back across Europe, and he was sent to. This is not really in the novel, but it's, to be run an escort ship between Casablanca and Dakar. But the thing that's interesting to know, which I did not know, is that in December 42, Darlan, who was Pétain's admiral of the fleet, who had been actually the captain of the first ship that the commander of the first ship that my grandfather was posted on, he went to North Africa and did a deal with the Americans and brought all of France overseas, what's called France Outre-mer, and the Navy under Allied command. He was promptly assassinated, But what happened after that is that Algiers became the capital of Free France, and from then on, de Gaulle and the Free French were operating out of Algiers. At which point, my grandfather was summoned back to what he was naval intelligence, and he was summoned back to participate in naval intelligence, running submarines into France, spies in and assets out. And then he was part of negotiating the peace in '45. But this is TMI, right? Sorry. But then but then there was this price to pay, which is all the people who were in de Gaulle's, who had been fighting for the Free French the whole time, were suspicious, of course, of the people who hadn't been. And so his naval career was going to go nowhere.
And so he ends up working in industry after that with medium success, I guess, some more successful than other. But one thing that's kind of fascinating, the story begins in Algeria, and Algeria is central to it, but it also is a kind of invisible center in the book. And that seems to be one of the things that the book is really about, the kind of, in a way, the invisibility of this history. And when Francois, is that how you pronounce it? The son of Gaston, goes to Amherst with a Fulbright, we hear Algeria featured barely more clearly in the French consciousness than did Puerto Rico or Guam for the Americans. So that was really surprising to me, actually, because I assumed that for the French, it would be a greater part of the kind of historical consciousness. But what Francois feels is that Americans have no idea what to make of him. You know, is he an Arab? People just don't know. And even in France, it is this kind of shadowy or sort of unknown status. And that seems to be a huge part of his experience as he moves through the world. And I mean literally moves through the world, because he lives in many places. And this sense of placelessness is really defining for him. And I think for his sister, Denise, as well. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, the sort of invisibility of Algeria and what it means to have this somewhat invisible place be central to one's own sense of origin and identity.
So there are many things I would say, I sort of many strands I could sort of go off in. I mean, I think there were various things in play. I think it was probably also true of British colonies, right? That there's some sense like, oh, they're from the colonies. They're from the, right? There's the metropole in the colonies, and the metropole is where it's kind of like how New Yorkers feel about the rest of the United States, right? You're like, oh, from Iowa, right? Like a sort of, it's not dismissive exactly, but it's vague.
Except right? Most of us New Yorkers came from those other places.
Of course. But I mean, which is also true in these countries, in these European countries as well. But which leads me to another thing, which is that for one of the things that for me the novel is about is the sweep of time and how the same thing looks different. The same experiences look very different depending on your moment in history and the culture that surrounds you. So for the grandparents' generation, colonialism is not a fraught thing. It was believed to be a good. But for Francois and Denise's generation, it's absolutely a fraught question. And one of the things that I think did happen, inevitably perhaps, is that as it became a fraught question and as it became understood in France that colonialism was deeply problematic and that nations needed their independence, there was a tendency then to sort of to project onto the colonials a sense that they were other. Right, that we in France have the moral high ground. We know that you guys with your antediluvian, old-fashioned, So when I mean the history of what happened at the end of the Algerian War is fraught for the white colonials, and particularly egregious for a community called the Harkis, who were the Algerians who had sided with the French and fought with the French, and so had to leave Algeria and come to France, and they were essentially put in camps and very badly treated by the French. And there's There's a novel came out a few years ago by a writer named Alice Senator called The Art of Losing, which I think won a Goncourt Prize and has been translated. And that tells the story of those experiences.
There's a sense that this dislocation and almost sort of itinerant move through the world that follows leaving Algeria over these generations has mental health implications, like real ones, for the characters. There are suicide attempts, there's depression, and as so often in dealing with any kind of mental health challenges, there's also secrecy and a wish not to talk about all of that. And there's a moment that's poignant when Gaston is considering his grandchildren. I think this is Gaston thinking or no, actually, maybe it's Francois. I'm not sure. I can't remember. Sorry. But I have a quote here. When Francois and Denise, meaning Gaston's children, were small, no idol to be found, the constant movement and disruption, the bombardments. Thank God these little girls could sleep in peace and frolic in the grass or in the lovely swimming pool. What else had it all been for? What was it for? This endless struggle, if not that. It's Gaston, right?
Gaston.
So it's Gaston reflecting on the very different childhood his grandchildren have had as opposed to his children. And indeed, his children struggle, both of them, mightily, in part as a result, I would think, of these dislocations. And I just wondered if you could speak to that, to the way in which the book is about processing generational trauma and how that plays out.
Yeah, a tiny little aside maybe that I might say is, this is a family. It's an ordinary family with these particular things, but it seems to me actually is the truth of millions of families, right? That the particular thing of being a white French colonial is one thing, but the 20th century, certainly the second half of the 20th century, and now in our 21st century, this is the experience of so many people, is to be for any of a number of reasons sort of pushed into a kind of peripatetic existence, and that can happen in a sort of less dramatic way within the United States, right? But certainly international migrations of various kinds, and I think there are traumas that come with that many more serious than what this family experiences. But I also think that it's a really interesting question. What does it mean to have a community and to belong somewhere? I think that about Alice Munro, right? Whom we just lost, and she knew she until late in her life was living in the house where her husband was born, in the town where she herself grew up, and she knew everything about it, and she knew the histories of all the families, and she knew to bedrock, and I feel like most people now aren't given that. Most of us don't have that experience, and there are varying degrees of it. But it is a thing. I think there are lots of different stories told about this in different versions. But to be new always somewhere and trying to figure it out, like learning. I mean, there's literally learning a language, but then there's also learning a culture, beginning again. You're wrong-footed. It's a different place to stand.
On the subject of language, this book is fascinating. You're dealing with a number of different languages. There are occasions in which people actually can't speak to each other because they don't speak the same language. And the prose, it calls attention to some of the language challenges. So when Francois is in America, he starts writing down lists of road signs, and he has a great way of describing American English. Where have I got it here? Oh God, I'm not sure. I'll find it in a second. But and then in an echo, and you do this a few times, which I loved, and I think maybe it is what you're talking about, sort of the same thing happening in different historical contexts. But Denise, Francois's sister, in Australia, notices the road signs, and she's paying attention to those. And then, of course, you have vernaculars that extend from the 1940s until basically the present, the 2010s. So I wondered if you could speak to the challenges for you in trying to take account of all of this language and especially find vernaculars that felt comfortable for dialogue, especially in these different eras.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that except to say, I was reading. Reading was very helpful for me in that regard, and reading. So I don't. Reading my parents' letters, say from before I was born in the 50s and 60s, that was really there. There's a certain particularly in my mother's letters, she was Canadian, so a very British influence, that sort of a certain jaunty, ironic tone that seems, Muriel Spark-ish. You know what I mean? Like I feel as though whereas the reading my grandfather's memoir, and this is aside, it's not so much perhaps about the diction itself, but realizing that the Catholicism was so pervasive and profound that when he, for example, sent a telegram from Casablanca to say to her in Algiers to say to his wife in Algiers to say he'd safely arrived, keeping in mind that it cost money for every single letter, he's like, safely arrived, sad but safe, and then this just like, we must thank him and put our faith in him, and I'm like, really? I'm like, yeah, I'm like, really? Like, what? But 3 lines of sort of effectively, religious exhortation. So the language gets, you start thinking, well, as you're trying to imagine it, you're thinking, well, what is it like if that's so profoundly internalized, that's your sort of. I don't think there was a lot of swearing. I don't think there was a lot of swearing there. No, for example.
So it's interesting that this idea of letters and documents is obviously central to the genesis of the story and also really central to the story. And when we begin in the 1940s, Francois is writing a letter to his father about a trench that he's built. He's 9, to hide in if there is a bombardment. So it's very poignant, and he's upset because it's rained and the trench is now basically a mud pit and looks too small for the whole family to fit into. But he's pressed with this job of being what his mother calls in French the family of smiles. She's told him, don't tell your father anything that will upset him. And this comes up again and again. Later Denise is writing to Francois, who thinks he's the repository of the hard truth. And guess what? She's been told, don't do anything to upset your brother. He's got this Fulbright and he's at Amherst and we really want him to. So there's this constant sense of everyone trying to be the family of smiles always, even as these very difficult things are transpiring. And I wondered, back to your grandfather's documents a little bit, was he presenting the family of smiles or was he actually telling it straight?
So in that document, I think one of the things that's interesting for me is that he wrote it for my sister and me when we were children, but he wrote to us as adults. So and he says, you won't read this for 35 years, and how right he was. But he's writing to us as adults, and so he's. There's in the novel there's quite a bit of fictionalization. There's much imagined stuff, but I think that there are certain things that he was more. Upfront about than certainly. Say my parents were, and I sometimes think that the secret, the thing of everybody protecting everybody else's feelings is one reason I maybe as a child thought I want to be a writer, because I just want to enough. I used to have a fantasy of a sort of completely what would a completely transparent relationship look like, where you actually didn't you just weren't always, but that would look terrible, I think, actually, but but it seemed an ideal to aspire to somehow, because the opposite seemed such a hall of mirrors, you know.
But it's interesting because storytelling is really at the heart of this. I mean, we begin knowing that someone in this book is going to be ultimately is the writer in essence. And we get a clue of who that is because it's the only narrator who narrates in the first person. So when she comes along, it's like, aha, okay, that's who it is. But we also have this kind of I don't want to say fake storytelling, but this slanted storytelling that is about shoring other people up, telling them the things that they want to hear, leaving out the things that are unpleasant, not talking about a car accident as a suicide attempt, even though we later realized that it was. And so I guess I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about storytelling as it functions in the novel and the way in which, on some level, this is about storytelling and what it does.
Absolutely, that's my hope. Is that, you know, as we say at my house, it's a Rashomon thing, right? Like there are many different versions. You can have the same experience, and everybody will tell a story differently. And that the way we tell a story will in fact shape what happens, or shape certainly. You know, there's an earlier novel I used as an epigraph a quote from Anthony Pohl. Where a character says, "It's not what happens; it's what you think happens that matters," and I actually really just believe that. I think that the ways that stories that we tell and the ways that we understand our lives do affect things. It's why I feel we should all be writing not dystopian climate fiction, but utopian climate fiction that will enable us. You're laughing, but I really mean it. Like we need to be imagining possible futures rather than, you know, terrible devastation, because it does have it has some knock-on effect. It really does. And I think in this novel, different characters are spinning stories about the family or about themselves that they need, that they want, or sometimes that serve them badly too.
And one way in which you clearly are leaping away from your grandfather's primary documents is in going into the points of view of various characters, which he could not do. And I'm curious about how you decided whom to focus on. How did certain people come to you? Just who felt available to you, and whether there was trial and error in that process.
You know, I think it seemed pretty clear to me from the beginning who was accessible to me and in what ways and with what limitations. So the Lucienne character, who's Gaston's wife, we do not enter her point of view, and that's for several reasons. One being that, I mean, I suppose, truthfully, one being that person I knew only through letters. But another being that in this very traditional Catholic patriarchal household, she is like Mary, you know, she's like the Madonna onto whom much is projected, but who isn't actually busy, you know, like she's a cipher. That's sort of her role in the household. So it would be a different narrative if she suddenly stood up and spoke from her own point of view. But the other characters, almost all of those older generation, we do. I mean, I did take that leap of imagination. Yeah.
What has it been like to share this with your family?
Well, there's only my sister of my family of origin who's living, and she was very generous about it, but I am aware, you know, there are lots of reasons why this novel I did not write 20 years ago. Lots of them. I mean, my own self and a sort of clarity of, I feel a sort of distance and clarity that I wouldn't have had. But you know, as you know, whenever you're teaching young people, say, how do I write about my family honestly without upsetting them? Good question. So to which, you know, one answer is, wait until they have departed. But I would just add to that, like, for me, this is entirely written in love, out of love. Like, I feel that one of the things that being in the middle of life and with this distance, and also reading these letters and so on from a time before I existed, when my family members were younger than I am now, and seeing them not as the, you know, people who grounded me or with whom I got in fights about whatever, but actually just as people, and people striving and hoping and being disappointed and having dreams that are thwarted, you know. And I feel like it is there. The corollary to that is, these aren't my parents. These are fictional versions. You know, these are. It is a papier-mâché thing. You have a form, and then something happens to it as you wind imagination around it. They become something else. They become their own selves. But it was entirely with an effort to see clearly and understand, and to say, you don't need the secrets. Everybody's okay, with all our terrible flaws, with all our limitations. It's okay.
I think one relationship where that really comes through is in Francois and his wife, Barbara, who have a pretty bad marriage, I think it's fair to say. And it's very poignant because Francois has in his mind the contrast of his parents, who had what seemed to be a quite an idyllic marriage. And he feels very alone in his marriage, and that comes through really strongly. But the thing that's interesting is that as the novel goes on, they sort of find an odd comfort even in their prickly distance. And there's a feeling that, you know, love can take all different forms, and that you know, sometimes an ideal requires a cipher, and maybe it isn't even as ideal as we think, or there are limitations to that. You know, being so dependent on a spouse can also limit one's own life, as we saw with Gaston when he makes that choice. So I found that very powerful and surprising, actually.
Well, I think, yes, I guess I mean, growing up, I had parents who quarreled quite a bit, and I always thought, if you had a perfect marriage, that'd be great. And then I realized, when I thought about it, no, that's a terrible burden to give kids, right? Like some illusion, this myth of a perfect marriage, like, no. Much, you know, it's the same. Like, I remember a friend who I was not raised Catholic, but a friend who was raised Catholic, saying, no. The great thing was I could kick back against it the whole time, you know. And if your parents' marriage seems perfect, that's much harder to do. And I also really believe that a difficult accomplishment that doesn't look necessarily like success, but is an accomplishment, you know, to stick by one another, you know, and there's that's not nothing. That's not nothing.
And one way in which this marriage would, I think, not be considered perfect by contemporary standards involves a secret, which I am certainly not going to reveal because you need to all buy the book and get to the end to find it out. But it's a whopper. And I found, and it's one of those revelations that immediately makes one reflect back on the entire story and ask the question of how much of what happens in the book is, to some degree, this secret reverberating through these generations. And I wonder if you could say a word about that without really getting into the secret itself. Good luck.
Well, I mean, I think that's always the case, right? Is that I don't know about you guys, but you know, what interests me as a reader, what interests me when I write, and I feel it's what interests you, is people, right? And how people relate to one another, and the things, the interactions and the dynamics, and you know, I feel like in the same way that when you're eavesdropping in a restaurant, and you're trying to figure out, like, they're on a date. No, it's not a date, but they don't know each other very well. So right? And you're listening, and you're trying to piece it together. And I think we're doing that all the time. We're always reading and interpreting. And in life, sometimes it's literally like a piece is withheld, right? And you're like, there's something. There's something that's not adding up here. What? But it, and then then like, oh, okay, it adds up now.
Yeah, I think you do that very effectively. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it open to all of you. And this is sort of a craft choice question. There are moments where you leap into the future and sort of give us a kind of telescopic view of what's coming, which I personally love. But I wondered if you could talk about. I mean, that was obviously a choice, and I would love to hear about how that came. Did that just feel natural? Was it? Tell me how that happened.
So it's a thing. It's a thing that a bunch of people do, but Muriel Spark definitely does it. Alice Munro does it sometimes. Muriel Spark does it a fair amount, and it is this. As I mentioned earlier, I think for me, time, this question of the passage of time and the arc of time, is really a narrative for me in the book, or is it a character? Is it a strand? Is it a whatever? Like, it's a thing. It's a thing in the book.
Your metaphor.
It's a thing in the book, and so it's almost to try to describe it almost visually. It's as if it's giving us a vanishing point, or it's giving us a distance. To project forward is giving us. That's how far we are from this thing, and this some sense of what a trajectory might be, if that makes sense, just occasionally. Yeah.
I love that. All right, questions from all of you. I see in the back, right next to the microphone, conveniently.
Hello. That was dramatic. I'm sorry. Hey, Claire. I have a question for you. Considering like we're in a period where like so many fiction writers are borrowing from their lives, from history, to invent the framework for their novels, and I'm curious in this period how you, particularly as a fiction writer, are preserving the imagination in that exercise of using something that is so intimate and close. What were some of the things you did to make sure that the facts that you had access to, the histories that you were trying to honor, did not compromise the imagination that makes fiction fiction?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. And I am somebody who I am not I'm not a writer of autofiction, and this is not an autofiction. There is a character who sort of corresponds to me, but who in the scheme of things is somewhat peripheral. And so I think I'm a great believer in any case. I think of it as almost like a pallet that lifts things off the ground, and it can lift things off the ground. Fiction, it can lift things off the ground by this much, or by this much, or by 100 miles, right? You can, but that distance, that freedom is essential, right? It's not firmly on the ground in that way, and so for me, always when I've written fiction, and I hadn't written autobiographical fiction, about family. I hadn't. I wrote a novel over 20 years ago, called The Last Life, which is also about the French Algerian legacy. And at the time, people said, "Oh, this is like a memoir," but it wasn't. There was a family that my aunt worked for in France, to whom there'd been several incidents, and I thought, well, I'll just take that coat hanger and make some papier-mâché of it, and I will make them pied noir. And then when I wrote the book, my aunt was like, they are pied noir, Claire. So whoops. But I think that sense that I've always taken things where I had some form, as I'm always saying to the students, everything is a balance of freedom and constraint. Everything is a balance of freedom and constraint. And you got to have some constraint. And you can choose any number of any sort of constraints. But if you, but in this case, I was choosing sort of historical actual places and actual sort of the actual configurations, sort of people who were in a place at a time, and then I didn't know what people said or what people did or what people, and then I couldn't, and then I was making it up, and for me, always the question is not so much and then as in why. Right. So why would these people be in this place? Why would they have this interaction? Why would somebody do something? Why would somebody try to commit suicide but not want anybody to know? Why would other people know that it was a suicide attempt but not want to talk about it? Right. That sense of why are we all that's, I think in life that's really what interests me. Is just what it's like to be human on the planet and the things that we do. So I don't know if that answers the question, but. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Just one moment. I think a mic will come your way.
It's for the live stream because we have people who can't hear if we don't use the mics.
I have the opposite question. I have in my family incredible archives from my father. He wrote letters and he kept carbon copies of all of them, including his love letters. And I've written pieces from those archives. But I could never make it into I know. I would like to be able to make it into something called a novel. But I mostly can't find the path to doing that. My background is in social science and I wrote a lot of books about public space, so you can see that I'm very observation oriented. Do you have any recommendations for me to jump out of the actual story and make it a novel?
So I think it is a risk, and it is a jump, right? And it is a little bit blasphemous, right? In a way, in the sense that you're taking, like I feel there are cultures where fiction is not okay because you're not supposed to play God. You're not supposed to take it in your hands and go with it, but at the same time, I suppose there are a variety of, depending what you would want to do. I feel there are a variety of different, a gamut of different ways you could go about it, and one is to that, if you think of it as that space, right, the space between reality and imagination that would liberate you to change the record, the historical record, to change the record by a little bit or a lot, right? You can't imagine doing that. But in this novel, there are things that I imagined that from scenarios I knew happen, and there are things that are completely invented. It's a novel. It's a fiction. So at some point, it takes off on its own, and then you're following the shape and the needs of the characters and their story rather than the facts, right? So there are a lot, but as I say, there's a whole gamut. There's a whole lot of ways to do that. Changing almost nothing, changing a great deal. I don't know if that helps.
Other questions? Yes.
You talked about Algeria as being part of this larger colonial heritage and project of France. My impression is it's actually had a very large role in terms of shaping both the cultural divisions and the political divisions in France, particularly during the War of Liberation. And I'm just curious, as you were writing the novel, how much of those repercussions back in France played out in the story, and how do you think that reverberates today? Because it really was the France grappling with the dark side, and you talk about the rejection of Pied Noir. It was in a way showing the dark side of the project in a very
Absolutely, and I, you know, I think I cannot, you know, I'm hearing, my father used to say at the dinner table, "Do not speak about things you do not know anything about." So I feel I don't know enough to. I wasn't there. I've read a bunch about it. I'm aware of things. This novel follows the characters who were not in France in that stretch for any length of time. I mean, there's one character, Denise, is there for a time, and then not. But there's no question that it is a wound that France has still not fully been able to grapple with, and that has shaped its history from 1830 arguably until now, but certainly from the 1950s until now, and that there are, as you say, profound political divisions. I feel as though I would have been able to answer out of experience better 20 years ago, when now there's this, there's the rise of the Front National, but I feel a lot of people who used to be communists, so a French working community that was formerly left wing is now voting Front National as well, and so they were traditionally the Pieds Noirs were very conservative, and that was a particular divide. But I don't actually fully understand enough of what has transpired to sort of speak about the present. But there's no question, of course, that one of the things, De Gaulle was very useful in, as you all know, in after the war, telling everybody, no, everybody was in the resistance. You were all résistants, right? And that was an important, speaking of storytelling, that was a really important myth for France to heal after World War II. But there wasn't a sort of similar narrative that could be constructed about the end of about Algerian independence and its aftermath and those legacies, as we know. I mean, if you follow anything about what's going on in France, the Algerian community, the North African community in France, the racism, all of that's just completely alive and terrible.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, right on the, yes.
Hi. I had a question about a sort of tension between the opening lines of the prologue, which are about the potential power of writing, and the final lines of the prologue, which are taken from Auden's poem or tribute to Yeats, I think from the very passage where he says, "Poetry makes nothing happen." So I'm kind of curious where you situate yourself in that tension and why it's one you introduce so early in the book.
Yes, thank you, Dotun. Yes, it is. I would say, can both things be true? Is it possible that we can hope and believe that? I really do actually. I do on some level. I mean, haven't we staked our lives on the idea that language matters, and that language, that stories matter, and that there is something that we can do, and then we also know. Well, for one thing, nobody's reading them, and for another thing, like even if we do, they don't necessarily change much. It is intentionally paradoxical, and it seems to me also a tension that exists in any of us as we embark in a world of words. Attention, all the more powerful in this time of an increasingly visual culture. It seems only, and yet there are things we can say in words that you cannot say in pictures, and we forget that at our peril, or neglect that at our peril, I think. Was there another part to the question? Is that it? Okay.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. Jennifer, thank you for leading it. Claire, it's just an honor to have you here. Thank you, thank you. So the fun continues. Claire will be on the other side of this wall, ready for book signing. So do sign up, do line up if you want to do the personalization. But maybe before you get in line, grab a drink at the cafe, have a little bit more discussion about this wonderful book, and enjoy meeting one another. I think I hit everything. Thanks for coming. Come back. Bye-bye.